Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's talk, which is going to be by Harold. Harold is probably one of the world's leading monarchists. Yes, he certainly is a staunch monarchist, and he was the chairman for a number of years of Tradition Leben in Germany, and he helped organise and keep it going. And Germany has a very well organised monarchist movement, and it advocates a federal state. So Harold's very well qualified to talk tonight about Europe in the first quarter of the 21st century, what's happened with Europe and so on. So without any further ado, I ask you to please make Harold welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for coming to my humble views. I had written my talk at the beginning of the week, but many aspects I had in them were already outdated. So things are changing rapidly in Europe at the moment, and nobody can predict where it will go. Just have to wait and see. In the weeks before the Russian troops invaded Ukraine, politicians from Western Europe were busily trying to convince Vladimir Putin not to trigger a war. French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, EU commissioners and UN Secretary General Guterres flew to Moscow and negotiated at the now famous gigantic table. They on one end, Putin on the other end. What they offered Putin, should he not send his troops, is only known to them and their governments. But it is unlikely they offer territorial concessions. That's what Putin really wanted. No one can promise the territory of another country. That is not done in the 21st century. The annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 by Russia was recognized only by a handful of countries like Venezuela, North Korea, and Syria. However, after the initial upset in 2014, most European countries went back to business. Although the occupation and annexation was condemned by nearly every government, nobody wanted sanctions that hurt Russia, because everybody knew sanctions would also hurt themselves. Putin is a very charming man. One may not like that, but he is able to charm people. His German is perfect, and he has only a slight accent. It's remarkable. As a KGB agent, he had lived in Dresden for a couple of years. His daughters were born there, and they spent their childhood years in East Germany. So he knows Germany pretty well from both sides. And what he learned as a KGB agent, nobody really knows. There are rumors that he took some secrets with him to Russia. He was at the center of Dresden, and everything went through him. On the other hand, there was Chancellor Angela Merkel, who speaks Russian, probably not as perfect as Putin speaks German, but she won a prize in a Russian-speaking competition in the GDR. So they found a good agreement for 16 years. But already since the 1970s, German governments in the West, of all flavors, followed the motto Wandel durch Handel, change through business. The better the trade relations, the lesser tensions there were between countries. That was the idea. When you are trading with someone, hostilities will decrease between your states. That was all the theory behind the deals. Russia provided cheap gas for Germans. 2 pipelines were built, Nord Stream 1 and 2. However, the change in the Russian society did not go in the same direction the Germans had wanted. Putin and the people around him slowly abolished the democratic rights that were introduced under the late President Boris Yeltsin. Members of the Russian opposition and those who Putin considered to be in opposition against him fled abroad, and killer commandos hunted them, in the UK as well as in Germany. Who still talks about the Malaysian Airlines flight MH17. Well, when I wrote that, nobody talked about it, but yesterday was the verdict. So nowadays, everybody's talking about it. But nobody really took sanctions against Putin because of the rockets that were provided by Russia. As head of state, Putin enjoyed diplomatic immunity and was always a welcome participant at international conferences. After a few weeks of tense relations and diplomatic protests, everything went back to normal. The business relations were too important to be endangered by bad behavior. But then came the 24th of February 2022. For weeks, Putin had sent Russian armed forces to the Ukrainian border, and on both sides, on the Russian side and the Belarusian side, Belarus had become a satellite state since President Lukashenko was under pressure after forging his re-election. Putin and Western observers thought the invasion army would conquer Ukraine in a couple of days, maybe weeks. Nobody gave the Ukrainian armed forces a chance to keep the invaders outside the country or throw them out of the country again. But the Ukrainian fighters succeeded in keeping the Russians out of the capital Kiev and, generally speaking, the west of the country. Russian troops advanced in the east and southeast. But it was no easy walk. The bombing and destruction of hospitals, schools, universities, residential buildings, power plants, etc. are horrific. And it will take years to rebuild the infrastructure. But they could not break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Nobody in Europe thought such slaughtering of civilians could happen again in the 21st century. In the 20th century, Ukraine had suffered under Lenin in 1921-23 and Stalin 1932-33, when the Holodomor, the devastation of the country, killed at least 4 to 5 million Ukrainians. And then World War II, destruction started again by the invading and retreating German troops, as well as by retreating and forward-marching Soviet troops between 1941 and 1945. The Ukrainian people had to endure unspeakable cruelties. Who would have predicted at the beginning of this year that everything would be repeated? Putin must have realized very soon after starting the invasion that this time the world would not quickly return to normal. Massive sanctions were imposed on Russia, on Russian oligarchs, on Russian businesses, and on Russian politicians. But sanctions are two-sided swords. This time, they also hurt those who imposed them. The West European industries could no longer rely on cheap Russian gas. And oil will no longer be permitted to be imported into the EU by the end of this year. No cheap oil anymore. In the end, it was Putin who decided not to export gas to Germany. The two pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and 2, were first closed for maintenance, and 2 months ago an explosion in the Baltic Sea stopped the gas export completely. Up to today, it is not known who was responsible for the explosion. Were the Americans behind it, because the Americans opposed the Russian gas export as well? Was it the Russians themselves? Or the Germans? The Swedes, or freelance rogues? It may be revealed one day, but at present the public is left guessing, as I did just now. gas has become a very precious commodity. In February, the average gas price was 6 euro cents per kilowatt in Germany. It rose to 40 cents and more. At the moment, the price has fallen again to 19.4 cents. But even this rate is a big burden for private households and industrial enterprises. Germans are very afraid of winter when the heating season will start. Germany had received more than 2/3 of her gas supply from Russia and was not prepared for different suppliers. Importing liquid gas was impossible because Germany did not have facilities in ports to receive tank ships. Qatar, the USA, and maybe even Australia might be willing to sell gas to Germany, but it cannot be brought into the country. The reliance on Russia was total. The higher gas prices are reflected in higher food prices. From bakeries to dairies, everything needs energy to be produced. And even the trucks need petrol, and if you have an electric car, electric truck, that electricity must be produced. And in Germany, the energy was produced by gas. 40% was made out of gas. At the moment, the German inflation rate is the highest since 1951, more than 10%. Higher inflation could mean higher social unrest. Demonstrations in many European cities are organized by various groups. While trade unions, socialist and communist parties demonstrate for higher wages and salaries, a lower house rent and aids for people in need to pay their heating and food bill. On the other side of the political spectrum, demonstrations are organized by middle-class people, craftsmen, shop owners, and one-man entrepreneurs who rely on cars and trucks, but are reluctant to pass on higher energy costs to their clients. Third and fourth generation bakeries have to close after more than 100 years as a family business because the ovens can no longer be run on gas. There are many reports on German television where a baker says, previously I paid 6,000 euros per month for gas, and now I should pay 40,000. I can't put that increase on my bread, on my other products. That is impossible, nobody would buy that. Yeah. The middle class is usually not demonstrating in streets, but this year it is different. They turn up at demonstrations organized by groups and parties that sit on the right ranks in parliament. In Germany, the Alternative for Germany, that's a new party founded in 2013 when there was a euro crisis, has seen a chance to gain more support. It seems to work because in opinion polls their vote share climbed to 16%, while in the 2021 Bundestag elections they received only 9%. What happens in Germany is reflected in other European countries. The parties to the right of the conservative mainstream are enjoying success in opinion polls due to the crisis of confidence in the usually ruling parties, whereby it is felt that the current governments are not doing enough to counter the insecurities faced by citizens, such as the rising cost of living, high energy prices, law and crime, migration, etc. The electoral breakthrough of right-wing parties represents the disenchantment of the general population with the mainstream political parties. Now I have three examples. First, Sweden. In Sweden, the Swedish Democrats emerged as the second largest party, garnering 20.5% of the votes, increasing their share from 17.5% in the 2018 elections. Marking their strong performance so far, the party assumed the role of the kingmaker in the formation of the new coalition government. the Swedish Democrats, a party that was once identified for its neo-Nazi roots, campaigned on immigration issues, coupled with the increasing gang violence in the country, which they pegged with the deteriorating law and order situation due to high migration and a parallel society in some cities or sections of the Swedish cities. High inflation, a looming energy crisis, and the conflict in Ukraine were also critical themes during the electoral campaign. For the first time, Ulf Kristersson, the moderate or conservatives, formed a minority government with the Christian Democrats and the Liberals that has to rely on the votes of the Swedish Democrats. In the Reichstag, he received all 176 votes of these four parties against 173 votes of the Social Democrats, Socialists and Greens. If his minority government will last for the whole 4 years has to be seen. For Sweden it is certainly an experiment, and it is not certain that the Swedish Democrats will gain from their participation in ruling the country, even if only from outside government. Their supporters have high hopes that the violence in the streets of Sweden will be brought under control, but it is not easy to fulfill that expectation. And then Italy. In Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, FDI, or Brothers of Italy, these are the first 3 words of the Italian national anthem, increased its vote share to 26% compared to 4% in 2018. Party leader Giorgia Meloni and the FDI have roots in the Movimento Sociale Italiano, Italian social movement, a neo-fascist party formed in 1946 by supporters of Benito Mussolini. That the party was renamed a couple of times, and they were coalition partners of Silvio Berlusconi's governments in the 1990s. Meloni's coalition partners included 2 veteran right-wing leaders, Matteo Salvini of the League, once founded as Northern League and aimed at migrants from southern Italy in the northern metropolitan areas, and Silvio Berlusconi of Forza Italia. What worked in Meloni's favor was that her party was the only one that chose to opt out of the unity government led by Mario Draghi, her predecessor, making it the sole opposition in the parliament. This led the party to attract a majority of protest votes. Moreover, Meloni, over the course of her campaign trail, moderated her party's image as an opponent of the EU, Ukraine, and the Northern Atlantic Treaty, or NATO. Other critical issues here, as in other European countries, include high cost of living, energy, immigration, and economic opportunities for young Italians. After she won the vote of confidence in both houses of the Italian parliament, Meloni said in her maiden speech as head of the government that she never had sympathies or was close to undemocratic regimes. The fascist race laws of 1938 that were directed at the Jewish population in Italy, she labeled as, I quote, the lowest point in the Italian history. Distancing from the fascist regime helped her in the first weeks to be received by her European colleagues with lots of kisses and embraces. Nobody held her activities as a teenager against her, and that includes Anthony Albanese, because yesterday I saw photos. He was sitting with Meloni at a table, frankly chatting, probably in Italian. I think he speaks Italian too. So he has no prejudice against a so-called former fascist youth member. But we have to believe her that when she says that what she did in her youth is now forgotten and she has learned. If this distancing from the fascist regime was enough for a new start as the first female head of government in Italy, has to be seen. She is certainly different from other Italian politicians. That's even evident in her refusal to use genderism. She made clear that she wants to be known as Presidente del Consiglio dei Ministri della Repubblica Italiana. She insists on the male form, not la Presidente or even la Presidentessa. As a single mother, she does not need genderism to demonstrate that she's a woman. Although her government is often styled as Eurosceptic, the appointment of Antonio Tajani, of Silvio Berlusconi's political formation Forza Italia, as foreign minister was a welcome move to prove the opposite. Tajani had been a member of the EU Parliament for over 20 years and served as its president from 2017 to 2019. He is well connected in numerous political branches in Brussels. What could prove very helpful should Italy have to negotiate deals with the EU. From a monarchist perspective, Tajani is a good friend. He has been a frequent guest of monarchist events. He never made a secret of his sympathies for the Italian royal family, and he attended many funerals, commemorative masses, and conventions of monarchist organizations. In the last general election, monarchist parties did not win any seats in the parliament, but that could change at any time. Like in other European countries or here in Australia, party loyalties diminish and voters float around, often casting their votes for minority parties or independents. There is also the risk for Fratelli d'Italia. Though they have a majority in both houses of parliament, party loyalties are not strong. In the past parliament, prominent MPs left their original parties and formed new splinter parties. That could happen to the three major parties of Meloni's coalition. Or the egos of the party leaders might get even bigger and they'll leave the coalition government. It is too early to predict Meloni's success or failure. Her start was not scandalous or outrageous, and has certainly no fascist reminiscence, despite establishing a ministry for family, birth rate and equality, or her promise to stop illegal immigrants. Many governments tried to stop the boats arriving on the shores. Few succeeded. Australia was one of them. However, predictions on the economic performance in the coming months and years are difficult to make. Interest rates are rising, posing an existential threat to the severely indebted government. Rome's gross debt amounts to 150% of the GDP. That is a ticking time bomb for every Italian government. Now let's go to France. In France, in April 2022, Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, National Rally, failed again in a runoff with President Macron. Compared to the last time's runoff in 2017, she gained nearly 20% more votes. This was partly due to the moderating image of her party, and she had raised issues such as unemployment, protection of the welfare state, and raising minimum wage. President Macron is deeply unpopular and has the image of an arrogant banker. In the legislative elections that followed 6 weeks after the presidential election, the Rassemblement National's tally rose from 11 to 90 seats, while President Macron's coalition assembled 251 seats and fell short of an overall majority of the 577 seats in the Assemblée Nationale. Other seats went to the Communists, 12, La France Insoumise, another populist left group, they gained 73 seats. The former Socialist Party that ruled after Mitterrand won in 81, they only got 28 seats. 22 seats went to the Greens. It is a very fractured and colorful parliament with lots of populist groups. The Rassemblement is only one of them, and this party is as vocal in their demands and condemnations as the leftists. Marine Le Pen did well in the runoff against Macron, comparatively, but she announced she would not be a presidential candidate in 2027, and she gave up the leadership of the party. Her successor at the helm of the Rassemblement National is 27-year-old Jordan Bardella, who won the ballot against a former lover of Marine Le Pen and mayor of Perpignan. If any of them will run in 2027, or if Marine Le Pen should be a presidential candidate again, is too early to tell. As de facto leader of the opposition in the Assemblée Nationale, she is trying to create the image of an alternative government. Her problem is that the populist left has been a formidable competitor when it comes to demanding higher wages, tax cuts, and early retirement. Illegal immigrants are equally not her topic alone. During the elections, she faced competition from a party called Reconquête, Reconquer, a reference to the Spanish Reconquista, against the rule of the Islamic emirs in the Spanish peninsula. And that group was founded by journalist Eric Zemmour. He won only 6% of the votes, but he is still present, and he's more radical than Marine Le Pen. It might be the biggest challenge for Marine Le Pen to remain relevant. No important elections are looming, and Emmanuel Macron has 4.5 years to run in the office. He cannot stand again due to term limits. 2 5-year terms are all that the Constitution grants him. How will he avoid to be seen as a lame duck cannot be predicted. Will he try to become a peacemaker in Europe, or will he play the tough guy? Will he concentrate on Europe in order that he can succeed Ursula von der Leyen as head of the European Commission? There are indications that Brussels might one day become his new home. If he could bring peace to Eastern Europe, his chances might increase to become Mr. Europe. He obviously tried to become successor of Guterres as Secretary General of the UN, but 2 Europeans in a row the UN will not accept. Putin is concentrating on destroying Ukraine's infrastructure. From power station to roads and bridges, schools, museums, universities. However, in recent weeks, he did not mention using nuclear weapons. He cautioned his threats, and he made less public announcements about them. He still has friends in the West, pacifists who oppose supplying weapons to the Ukraine, as well as people who consider the old Soviet Union and its successor Russia as an old friend and ally. They want more or less unconditional peace negotiations. They think Russia, or Putin, should be able to save face. No humiliations should drive Putin to use the ultimate force. A defeat of Russia would, in their eyes, not bring a lasting peace to the region. Political leaders in the West are more skeptical. Peace with Putin seems to be impossible. Regime change is not the West's business. Russia does not have a king who could exchange the head of government. In July 1943, it was the Italian king, Vittorio Emanuele III, who summoned Mussolini, had him arrested and installed a new anti-fascist government. Equally, King Michael I of Romania acted in 1944 and had Marshal Antonescu arrested, switched sides like Italy in 1943, and joined the Allied forces. This scenario is unimaginable in Russia. There is no courageous king to have Putin arrested and have him replaced with somebody else. How smoothly the change in the position of head of state can go could have been seen when Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II passed away on the 8th of September. Everything after the announcement of her death went according to protocol and tradition. Her eldest son and heir was proclaimed king. No counting of votes for weeks, no claims of rigged elections, and no one tried to storm Parliament to prevent the swearing in of the government and the members of Parliament. I love the monarchy. That is so much easier to have a succession that works. The last look I will have on Turkey. Erdogan is, I don't know if he's well known in Australia, but in Europe he is famous for his erratic behavior. Erdogan's intricate acrobatic vis-à-vis the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th reflects a similar dilemma. Russia is Turkey's biggest energy supplier. Russia and Ukraine together are Turkey's biggest tourist markets and grain suppliers. Turkey became the only NATO member to purchase the Russian-made S-400 anti-aircraft system, risking suspension from the US-led multinational program to build the F-35 Lightning II combat aircraft, while at the same time supplying armed drones to Ukraine. Seemingly caught off guard by the invasion, Ankara sought to have its cake and ate it too. It supported Ukraine's territorial integrity and condemned the Russian invasion as illegitimate and unacceptable, yet abstained from voting on Moscow's suspension from most bodies of the Cooperation Council in Europe and refrained from joining the Western sanctions on Russia. And while Ankara blocked the passing of Russian military vessels from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea through the Dardanelles and Bosporus, at Kiev's request, and in accordance with the 1936 Montreux Convention, it did so with Moscow's consent, after clarifying that the closure applied to all parties, stating his determination to abandon either Russia or Ukraine, and not to compromise our national interests. Erdogan offered his good offices to both belligerents, and on March the 10th, the Russians and the Ukrainian foreign ministers met in Ankara at the highest level talks since the onset of hostilities. Turkey abolished the Sultanate exactly 100 years ago, on 1st of November 1922, but President Recep Erdogan behaves as if he was the new Sultan. Not only did he build palaces that are Putin's envy, but he makes life of the opposition extremely difficult. During his 20-year rule, Erdogan has increasingly acted like an Ottoman Sultan, consistently escalating crises with adversaries and never retreating so as to uphold his untamed tough guy public image. Diplomatic maneuvering and courtesy do not fit his rising imperialist posture. Only when he has felt that Turkey's economic weaknesses threatened his political power and re-electability has he allowed his pragmatic self to prevail over his ideological and imperialist self. For while self-attendissement has become the hallmark of Erdogan's confrontational foreign policy, there is little doubt that he has miscalculated Ankara's economic and military might when he promised his loyalists a return to the glorious days of the Ottoman past in time for the centennial of the Turkish Republic in 2023, when the Turks will go to the polls to elect their next president and members of parliament. Turkey's threat of military action in the Aegean and Mediterranean seas over littoral sovereignty disputes and hydrocarbon claims, perpetual military tensions with Greece and Cyprus, and a Turkish plan to flood the EU with millions of Syrian migrants have all quietly vanished after the EU imposed minor sanctions on Turkey and threatened tougher ones. But in October he repeated his covert threats against Greece. He said, I quote, "Whoever disturbs us, which country might attack us, our reaction will always be, we might come to you in the middle of the night." He made a similar warning in September when he claimed Greek defense installations had aimed at Turkish fighter jets. He accused Greece of having militarized Greek islands close to the Turkish shores. And of course he claimed his right to self-defense. The sentence that Turkish troops may come in the middle of the night he made previously before military operations in Syria and Iraq. There Turkish troops are fighting Kurdish units who Erdogan says they support Kurdish terrorists within Turkey. And Turkey has occupied territories in Syria and in Iraq, which Erdogan uses as settlement areas for Syrian refugees loyal to him. Erdogan is risking hostilities at the southern Turkish border, in the southwest with Greece, in the northwest with Russia, and economic unrest with high inflation rates and weak economy. Tourism first suffered under the pandemic, then the war in Ukraine kept large sections of Ukrainian and Russian holidaymakers away from the holiday resorts in Turkey. It needs the skills of a wise leader to solve at least some of Turkey's problems. Until he is firmly re-elected, any erratic move from his side is possible. Now, I touched only a few of the topics that shake Europe at the moment. There had been many happier times when you talk to the Europeans, but nowadays they're very pessimistic. In my youth, people thought the future would be better and brighter for their children. Nowadays, they think the future might be worse than at the present time. In the first draft I had written for David, I had two more topics, Denmark and separatism. I dropped them because the talk would have been too long. And then Queen Margaret II's Golden Jubilee is important, and but on the scale of the war in Ukraine, it is only a sideshow. The same goes for the separatist movements in Scotland, Belgium, Spain, and other countries in Europe. They are very quiet at the moment, perhaps with the exceptions of Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland. They may become more vocal once peace has been restored in Eastern Europe, but that will be a topic for another talk. Thank you very much.
Any questions or comments, please?
Yes, Harold. Islamisation of Europe. I just did a bit of research a couple of weeks ago, and from the internet I gained that the Islamic population of Germany is about 6 million. In France it's about 5 million. Very considerable. And I think this is a very salient point. The Muslim populations have a superior birth rate to the general population. What's your view as to how that, even now they must be having quite an effect on public life, but in years to come, one would assume that could only be greater. What's your assessment of that?
I'm glad I'm not a politician. I don't have to take any decisions in Europe. That is, in my eyes, a problem. But I have no solution for that. Mm-hmm. The politicians decided to abolish borders. Everybody who comes to Germany and says, I claim asylum, can stay, even if their refusal to be granted asylum is refused and not returned to their home countries. They can stay. That's the new policy of the red-green government. They said if they are integrated, they can stay. or the coalition government in Berlin passed a new so-called citizens' money. That's social support, social benefits. That was increased, and now about 2 million people can receive that money. That is approximately 1,800 euros a month.
Quite considerable.
They don't have to do anything for that. But to make it acceptable, they said, oh, well, that's for the old pensioners and the single mother and the new families who have many children, etc., etc. But the figures say 40% of the recipients are foreigners. The policy is, a lot of Syrian refugees came in 2015. If they brought 4 wives, their marriage is recognized as legal in Germany. You have reports in newspapers saying that they have one man said, I have 23 children. Why should I go to work? I get my money from the state. I'm not making the laws, I'm not voting on the governments. The Germans have to decide what to do with such a move. If they're happy with that, I can't prevent it.
But the brighter ones will be going to university and, you know, becoming doctors and lawyers and so forth.
Yeah, that's the theory.
Yes, well,
I don't know.
yeah.
I have no idea.
I think that's about as far as, but I know in England, a friend of mine, her daughter married an Englishman and has lived there as a British citizen since 1995, and she attests that in 3 areas at least, in London, Birmingham and Leeds, there are areas that are actually, you know, they're virtually 100% Muslim. Their Sharia law is being practiced. And the police, for political reasons, the police just turn a blind eye because they're told by the politicians to do that. So Islamisation of Europe is alive and well. That's about as much as I could make from that.
Well, at the moment it's, you said 6 million in Germany. That's about 8% of the population.
And it's about 5 million.
Yeah, but they're concentrating in certain areas.
And the same in England, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Like in Berlin and
You're in a position to take the call later on.
Well, look, thank you for that.
You're in a position to take the
Okay.
call later on.
I was just about the Ukrainian thing.
Just a meeting, David.
Do you think that Putin had any
I'll hopefully speak to you later.
anticipation of the degree of opposition he was going to face in this instance, compared to what, given that he faced very little with Crimea and Georgia and all those other instances? Do you think he really has been taken aback by this?
I think his idea was he wants to reunite Ukraine with the mother country, with motherland. And he thought it was easy, because Ukraine, although 50 million people live in Ukraine, their army was not very efficient, not in 2014. So he thought a quick war, not many casualties. I don't think he wanted to kill millions. I don't think that was his aim. But
did he think that perhaps that would have been welcomed in the Ukraine, that move would have been?
I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so. Maybe by some. He has his friends in the Russian-speaking East, but the people in the West, they were under the Habsburg Empire for 200 years. They had a complete different socialization. They were oriented to the West, not to the East. For them it was always kind of punishment to live under the Soviet Union. If you see photos of Lemberg, it's like a Habsburg city. It's like little Vienna. It was very, very important, and the Habsburgs loved that area. They even tried to install one of the Habsburg members as king of Ukraine. Vladimir the Red Prince he was called,
Yes.
because he was speaking Ukrainian.
So, one final question from me. In terms of support for Putin in Russia, is there any real opposition to him, or is he just really there?
It's difficult to say because everybody who is really opposing Putin is arrested and sent into a labor camp.
Is that
Opposition must come from within. If the people around him decided, well, he is no longer useful, we have to replace him with somebody else who is acceptable to negotiate with Ukraine, with the West, with other countries as well. Maybe there will be a palace revolution. Maybe. Don't know.
How hard are they being the sanctions hurting the Russians, the general population? Do you know that, or any idea of that?
Population is 150 million. But the problem in Russia was Russia decreased by 1 million people every year, even before the war, because the young people migrated abroad. They didn't see a chance within Russia. And then the birth rate is very low. Now, having hundreds of young men being killed in Ukraine for nothing doesn't increase the population in Russia. To the contrary, these young men don't found families, they don't start businesses. It is certainly a disaster for the near future. At the moment, he can cover up everything. He can send compensations to the widows and to the families who are grieving the loss of a brother, of a son. But in a couple of years, the money will not be there. And if all these Western markets find other places where they can get their resources, why should they return to the Russian market and buy oil and gas? Germany is now finding other means, and other European countries are doing the same. So not only at the moment sanctions are holding him here, but in the future the markets aren't there anymore.
John?
Harold, anyone who opposes Putin will be sent to a labour camp, as you say. What happened during the time of the long-established monarchies in Europe when there was opposition?
Which country do you mean?
Well,
Russia?
Russia?
Russia had labor
Russia?
camps for
France?
centuries. France? No, they weren't. Opposition was very common in France. Not only writers, but the parliaments were full of people who opposed not only the monarchy, but different houses of the ruling families. That was not a problem in France.
Why have the monarchies all effectively collapsed in Europe then?
That is a very good question. Where to start? Well, I start with Germany because that is the country I know best. After World War I, the monarchies toppled, all 28 of them. And the head of the Bavarian royal family, Herzog Franz of Bavaria, he was asked, why didn't your family resist the revolution? And he said, in November 1918, everybody was exhausted. They didn't want to fight, they just wanted peace. After 4 years of butchering millions of people, they didn't want to continue the fighting. In Bavaria, The day of the revolution was the 8th of November. In the morning, King Ludwig III was having his usual morning walk in the parks without a bodyguard. He wasn't touched by anyone. And in the afternoon, people gathered on the big place in front of the Parliament building, and one man went to a balcony and said, "I proclaim the Republic of Bavaria." And nobody opposed him. Who should have opposed him? Soldiers were hardly in Bavaria, they were in the field. They were in Flanders, they were in France. What was left in Bavaria, in Munich, were a few toy soldiers, personal bodyguards. They couldn't do anything. And they didn't want to fight. So, and after the monarchy was abolished, or declared abolished, it was difficult to bring it back. They tried. They tried in 23, they tried in 32 to prevent Hitler, they tried again in 1945, but the Americans didn't want it, and yeah, it didn't come back. And when I look to other countries like, where shall I look to? Portugal in 1910. That was also more or less like an accident. It was a small group of soldiers who were dissatisfied with their salary. They declared the monarchy abolished, and there was a royal yacht in the harbor, and they put the royal family on the yacht, and they had to leave. And the monarchists tried in 1911 to start a counter-revolution, but they were beaten. They didn't have the numbers. And again, when Salazar came in 32, there were hopes for the monarchy. I met Portuguese monarchists who were monarchists in the 4th generation. That's a tradition that went through the families. And they had parties, and they were in parliament, they were even part of the coalition government, but they didn't succeed in bringing back the monarchy. Now, I read in an opinion poll that 32% of the Portuguese want the monarchy. 32 is a good number, but it's not a majority. What could be done to make it 50% at least? I don't know. I'm no longer in Portugal and can't visit the Portuguese monarchists. I would like to know what they are doing. 32 is a good figure after 112 years of a republic, but not good enough.
Can I ask, as a monarchist, how do you see the future?
How do I?
See the future.
For monarchy, how do you see the future for monarchy
Here in Australia?
Or in Britain or around the
Well,
world?
anyway,
Britain, I'm not worried in Britain. And here, we have to fight. Nothing is granted as a present. If you want to keep the monarchy, you have to do something for it. You have to talk to other people, you have to inform them, you have to meet other monarchists and encourage yourself so that you're not losing your hope. That's need come together. And
so you could make monarchy a populist cause.
you could, yeah. Yeah, if you say not every post in the state should be occupied by a politician, for example, that is populist. Politicians are not popular, so use that sentiment. It's tricky, and politicians are necessary. I don't want to abolish the politicians, but they should obey to certain rules and accept that somebody is sitting above them who is not telling them what they have to do, but who is there to advise them, help them to find the right decision. He's impartial, he or she. And that idea should be made popular.
It would be difficult.
Yeah.
Is that right, Kevin? Yeah.
Just listening to your talk, the general thing, the theme that runs through it is basically that Putin, by his actions, probably totally unintentionally, has really upped the ante, increased the level of social unrest throughout Europe, just dramatically. And in some ways that reminds me of what happens, well, what happened in the First World War and the Second World War, certainly these big conflagrations, but there's huge unrest and disruption, and the world changed to never go back to the same. You think, I know that what we're dealing with in the Ukraine is not on the scale of a world war, but do you think it's a similar sort of thing that has he set off a thing that is just totally out of his control and the rest of the world's control, and things are just not going to go back to the way they were, like these extreme causes that you've sort of talked about, sort of coming out of here, there and everywhere. They're bubbled up now, and we're not going to see them.
Yeah, I don't think there's a kind of dark force behind the scenes who are pulling the strings. What is now happening in Europe seems to be a little bit out of control.
Yeah.
And where it will end up, nobody knows. The winter will be decisive, not only in Ukraine and in Russia, but also in Western Europe. Because if people freeze at home, the social unrest may be phenomenal. What they are doing in Germany is now they are preparing halls, so-called warming halls, where people who can't use their heating at home can turn up and find a warm place during the day. This is 1920s.
You mean
And there are food...
holes in the ground?
Yeah. It's prepared officially. Nobody is making a secret out of it. And they have soup kitchens.
Soup kitchens.
Soup kitchens. They are already prepared for people who can't afford to buy food and prepare it at home. But they can't prepare it because the gas isn't there or the electricity is not there. They are preparing for blackouts. Because if everybody has little heaters at home, when the gas supply is not there, so the central heating doesn't work, everybody has little radiators at home, and then the whole energy net will collapse. For days. Then there will be no water, because the pumps aren't working anymore, they need electricity. There will be no television, no internet, no telephone. People with electric cars, they sit at home, they can't use their electric cars anymore. And they are preparing for that scenario. But it's one thing to prepare for it, and another thing when it really happens. How will people react? Will they be panicky? Will they be angry? Will they be rioting, or will they be resignating, sitting with 3 blankets at home? Stay in bed all day because that's a warm place? Nobody knows. But it will be very difficult. And bakeries, when they have no gas, they can't bake bread. How many bakeries still use wood? People are now go to the forests and steal wood. They cut trees and take the wood home.
This is in Germany.
In Germany, yeah.
Everything that's been taken for granted could potentially collapse.
Yeah, it's the normal civilization is in danger.
You touched on the internet and computers. Well, that will have, say, a blackout for days where businesses can't do business as they normally would. That's going to have an enormous effect, surely.
Yeah. People are advised to have a radio at home that works with batteries.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
They can't use television. Nothing. And they are warned if they use candles, there's fire danger.
Mm.
And the fire brigade wouldn't be able to come in and extinguish the fire because the water wouldn't be available.